Hi, I'm Simon Pulman, and you're listening to the Tomorrow with Rovio podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Tomorrow with Rovio podcast. I'm your host, Ben Mattis. And today's podcast guest is an interesting one. His name is Simon Pulman. He's a partner and co-chair of Cohen, Debates, Abram, and Shepherd, LEP. So yes, I have a lawyer on a podcast about entertainment. And that might strike you as a little bit weird, but Simon's a special guy. He's a mega geek who is a just huge consumer of all things media and entertainment. He's quite insightful. He spends a lot of time sort of thinking and blogging and kind of writing about major trends inside of entertainment, obviously with a focus on law. But if you're at all interested about, how rights management is going to evolve as, more games become movies or more movies become games, how things are evolving now that we have streamers and creators working and sort of monetizing content created by game developers. What's going to happen with NFTs and crypto, and how is that going to change rights and law? What's going to happen when, we sort of increasingly live our lives in some of these virtual worlds, and increasingly we're monetizing and making money based off of IP that, might be sort of 3 chains up the ladder in terms of ownership. In an increasingly digital, increasingly interconnected, increasingly remixed world, the legality of a lot of this stuff is, at least to me, really interesting. If you find anything that I just said even remotely compelling, I think you'll find this interview with Simon worth your time. So thanks very much. Enjoy. So Simon, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let's start with introductions. Introduce yourself, what you do, talk a little bit about why you, a lawyer, are on this podcast talking about the future of entertainment.
Well, we'll see how much value I can actually provide to the audience. So my name's Simon Pullman. I am indeed an entertainment attorney. I work for a firm called Cohen Debates. We have a New York and a Los Angeles office. I'm based out of New York, and my practice really spans entertainment. A lot of my work is actually on the television side of things, if we can still call it television in the world of streaming and over the top, but episodic. So, doing legal and business affairs in terms of acquiring material and hiring writers and attaching producers and doing deals to sell shows to all types of platforms, both traditional and digital. But my practice also spans across motion picture, podcast, gaming, and some other sorts of forms of progressive and interesting digital forms of content. As to why I'm here, I mean, I think probably because I have had a very deep and involved interest in sort of the convergence between traditional entertainment and digital media. For well over a decade at this point in time. When we did the pre-call for this, Ben, we were trying to work out how we were connected on LinkedIn, and we came to the conclusion it had something to do with our common connection to Jeff
Right.
Gomez, and his company Starlight Runner, which is a client of ours, and I've known Jeff for a long time. And I actually saw him yesterday, and he and I have very sort of shared interests in how entertainment is evolving in the interaction between content and the audience.
Yes.
And the ability now to really do things that lie in that space between what we might have once called sort of traditional media and gaming, or interactive. The difference is that I approach it probably from a little bit more of a deal making and a legal sort of rights perspective, and this kind of thing. I think it informs a lot of my work.
Great.
In terms of being able to try and future-proof clients for these kinds of things that are to come. I love the work that I do in terms of I love working through, complex rights things and drafting and nuance and all of these kinds of things. But I'm at my heart, a huge nerd.
That's
So, a massive consumer of movies and TV and games and comic books and all of these kinds of things.
A lot of people probably think they know what a lawyer does, and they probably think they know what a sales guy or a biz dev guy does. But you use this term business affairs, which seems to sort of pull a little bit from both. And I do think it's going to tie into some of our further questions down the line. So can you just talk a little bit more about your day to day? When you sign a deal, kind of how are you looking at it? How are you tackling it?
Yeah, it is interesting because I think people who are perhaps more familiar with other sort of strands of law or just lay people, think of lawyers being with a huge stack of documents. And I do have a huge stack of documents. My floor is just, paper all over the place. And I do a lot of drafting. But, in sort of entertainment parlance, business affairs is the actual negotiation of the material deal terms. So in our practice, certainly there are circumstances with some clients where, the client says, here's a deal, here's, some closed terms, draft a contract, or we received this contract from a vendor, please review it. Yeah. And, we're service providers. We live to serve. We're very, very happy to do that. But my practice sort of goes beyond that insofar as I very often am the person who is making an offer. So for instance, if you were, let's say, you had an independent writer of a graphic novel or an independent developer of a video game that you've published on Steam or something like that, and my client said to me, we really love this game. It has a great aesthetic. We think we could turn this into a movie, into a TV show. Essentially, they would say to me, "Go and make a deal, Simon." So I would go and I would make an offer to you or your representative, and we'd work through the terms. And that is sort of, that is the business affairs piece of it. So we're talking about what the money is in terms of upfront and potentially down the line. What scope of rights are being granted? What are you going to get in terms of credit? Will you have any kind of approval over the end product? Which is, I'm sure we'll talk about. The old Hollywood sort of adage was, "Here's some money, go away." Yeah. We don't want the author. No, we're not interested in your opinions. What could you add that's relevant?
It's ours now.
It's ours. Yes, it's ours now. You'll get a net profits check in 10 years if you're lucky. But that sort of has very much changed for a variety of reasons, which I could certainly speak to. So that's sort of my day to day. So there are certainly times when I'll sit for 2-3 hours and draft some documents. I mean, I'm in the middle of a couple of quite complicated ones at the moment. But a lot of it is also just being on the phone and talking through. And look, we try to approach deal making in a collaborative, problem solving way. You as a rights holder or representing a writer or a platform that's looking to you have certain mandates from your client or from your company, and I have certain requirements as well, and we try to get to a point where neither of us are happy.
Cool. That
Both
sounds
happy.
Like the perfect compromise. A world where everyone's just a little bit disappointed.
That's the cliche about negotiation. Yeah.
Okay, so you've been doing this for a bunch of years, and you hinted at it just before that, you sort of suggested that maybe the sophistication of the deals and probably the expectations of the right holders are evolving over time. And that's very interesting. And I'd love to dig into that a little bit more as well. But to begin with, I'm wondering if you can talk at all about any of the sort of the mega trends. This is a term we use a lot at Rovio and inside the gaming industry, this concept of mega trends that you've seen just by definition of your deal flow. Like over the decade that you've been doing this, you've probably, I don't even know how many deals you've probably managed, but it's probably a lot. Have you noticed any things that are ebbing or flowing across entertainment sort of as a whole that you wanted to bring up?
Oh, certainly. And I think there are two or three that are probably germane to this conversation. I think one, I mean, clearly there's a rise in episodic over motion picture, and
Yeah.
there's a general rise in sort of competitiveness for properties driven by the SVOD platforms and the number of buyers. I don't think we even have to talk about that. It's just it's obvious.
Yep.
What I think is interesting is perhaps the idea of all of the major conglomerates are moving away from the idea of sort of a single container, so meaning like a single movie. I
Right.
you know, if you look, I think it's very sad for sort of sort of cinephile purists, who just love a movie, for example, but where value is really built is in having something that can be expanded.
Yeah.
And that's sort of just a huge trend across entertainment, and I think that the various companies are doing it with different levels of success. Clearly, an obvious example is Marvel Studios and the Marvel
Yeah.
Cinematic Universe, which started off as a series of motion pictures that became more and more interconnected, has now done it really quite marvelously, in my opinion. Transitioned into television. And is those it's interesting to look at the approaches of the different SVOD platforms, because Disney has really thus far, putting aside the kid stuff which has its own value, as far as adult content, has really built its platform on the back of two or three major IPs, primarily
Yeah.
Star Wars and
Marvel.
Marvel, and everybody's looking for their own piece in terms of things that people will love and will cause them to come back. And so, from a deal making perspective, I think all companies are looking to own things, and they're looking to have the right to do derivative productions. And on the rights holder side, well, what does that mean? It means, what does your participation look
Right.
like in all of those different types of things? And it tends to be one of the key points that we're discussing. In terms of other major trends, clearly there's a massive move towards telling more diverse stories.
Okay.
It is a big movement in Hollywood, and I would say all of our clients are actively looking in that way to do things in a sort of a more authentic way, in terms of acquiring underlying material from people who are who have different perspectives and different backgrounds and
That's
so
interesting.
forth. But also making sure that the staffing and so forth is allows those stories to be told in an authentic way. And then from my perspective, sort of looking forwards, I think that the one of the things that's been accelerated by the pandemic, in addition to all sort of forms of sort of home entertainment, is just clearly interactive and gaming.
Right.
Just massive, and it's really interesting to see. Some of our clients are very traditional media. Some of them are are actually squarely in that space. It's interesting to see the sort of the big spread in terms of people's awareness of this, and how they're beginning to sort of understand the value of sort of gaming and game IP, and that sort of direct engagement with audiences, which really the game companies have mastered in a way that and I think it's a very tricky thing to do at times, but in a way that traditional Hollywood has not necessarily.
Right. Very interesting. And those are great mega trends. God, I could spend an episode talking about each one of those. But so I'm wondering, do you also see, and maybe the answer to this question is no, in which case that's fine, we can move on. But do you also see trends in the sort of content, and maybe diversity is an example of what I'm looking for here? But let's take let's take a page out of Jeff's thinking, right? So once upon a time you had the hero's journey. And so you had a hero and you had a villain, and the story had, generally speaking, 3 acts, and there was a beginning and a middle and an end, and then, whatever, you saved the damsel in distress and you were done. And Jeff talks about the collective journey, and he talks quite a lot about ensemble casts and the kind of power of ensemble casts, both in terms of creating a more diverse story world, right? That has more derivative opportunities, as you've just discussed, but then also as an opportunity for the sort of collective engagement where you have the meta community has more to talk about because there's more threads, there's more conversations, there's more people to like or dislike, and there's more ebb and flow of who's the good guy versus who's the bad guy. So if you take, I don't know, like The Walking Dead as an example, right? Like it was, you could be, Team Rick Grimes one week, right? And then just the next week, just be like, forget that guy. I'm completely over him. I never want to hear his name mentioned again. And that was okay. And that gave you an opportunity to really deeply engage in the fan forums or what have you, wherever your tribe lived. So have you seen any of these sort of almost more like genre trends
Yeah,
or themes?
it's fascinating. I mean, in terms of sort of broad, genre trends. I mean, clearly, one thing that all of the platforms are trying to do is to build their own sort of fantasy or sci-fi
Right.
universe.
There
Amazon
it
has
is.
several bets, including obviously Lord of the Rings being purportedly a massive one, but there are a lot of properties. And I think to your point about the characterization, I always think about this as just an interesting one. Indiana Jones, right?
Hmm.
Indiana Jones is the name of a man, and so that's that. Unless they can find a way with this new film, and I think they tried to do it with the previous one when they had the Shia LaBeouf as the son. Maybe he was going to inherit it. I don't know. But to sort of expand beyond that is going to be a challenge for them, and presumably they want to be able to do that, whether it's via recasting or expanding the universe or whatever else, because they want Indiana Jones to keep going. More
Yeah.
series, more movies, more theme park rides, etc., etc. From what you're saying, what's interesting about a lot of these properties be they sort of based on fantasy, based on novels or graphic novels or games, is that yes, there are a variety of entry points and characters to sort of relate to. Now, from my perspective, this is sort of above my pay grade insofar as I'm not really involved in the creative. I am in the deal making, and in terms of things that might implicate this, well, it's interesting because one of them is we're starting to see covenants in contracts that require, for example, a cast member to, if it's based on the book, not be gender switched, not be, national origin or race switched, and so that's sort of contractually mandated. But the other piece, which is interesting, which kind of interacts with this, and I'm curious as to your thoughts actually, is the power of a star, because one of the things that's really been a massive trend is you got so much noise, so many parties developing projects right now, and so many buyers looking to cut through. And I'm sure we've all seen certain things drop to an SVOD platform like Netflix or what have you, and it's like you see a few trailers for a week around the release, then crickets, and then if you're in the industry, you might see, a month later it's been cancelled.
Yeah.
And so looking at the approaches, because one thing we're seeing as another big macro trend is using a star in a star role to cut through the noise, to make people be aware of it. We've got some projects like that. Clearly there are others. I think talent's more amenable to doing TV now, whether it's Henry Cavill in The Witcher, or I'm watching Mayor of Easttown with Kate Winslet at the moment, which I think is very good. But the downside of that is, I find a little bit, is when you have something that's star driven, typically speaking, for contractual and other reasons, you know how it's going to turn out. You know how the story is going to develop.
Yeah.
And presumably the star is going to prevail. They might even have contractual provisions that they must prevail. I mean, I remember this thing like I don't know how true this is, because I'm really not involved. So, disclaimer, I have no personal knowledge of this, but like this purported contractual thing between The Rock and Vin Diesel in Fast and the Furious, that like neither one of them could lose a fight or something, so they had to like have a stalemate in the screenplay. But I mean, what do you think? When you have something in the audiovisual realm, is it attractive to you to have, oh, okay, there's Tom Cruise in it, or whoever,
Sure.
that's recognizable, or do you prefer to say get lost in the immersion of having no name actors?
It's a very interesting question. I can only speak obviously for myself and all of this, but one of the mega trends, just anecdotally, one of the mega trends that Rovio has identified, we call it consolidation. And inside consolidation, we talk about sort of mergers and acquisitions and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We also talk about this theme of black hole games, right? So games that just suck up energy and time and play and engagement from players, and then are very difficult to escape, right? Kind of once you're in
From
Fortnite,
the perspective of the player's time, or from the perspective of sucking up so much of the just general eyeballs that becomes hard to compete with those games?
Well, both. But if you think about Fortnite as an example, right? Or World of Warcraft was a perfect example. Like, so many people wanted to quit World of Warcraft. Like, I don't know how to quit you. Like, they couldn't get out because all of their friends were in, right? That was where their
a
life
network
was.
Effect.
That was where their online community was, right? And if you were Age of Conan was a fantasy MMO subscription base that tried to launch around the time of World of Warcraft, and it just hit the Blizzard wall of like, well, we can't get enough players, even with the Conan brand, right? We can't necessarily get enough players for this thing to become its own little mini black hole, self-sustaining, so that it can start actually pulling players organically out of the World of Warcraft. And ultimately, Age of Conan, whatever, like they more or less died, right? I mean, certainly they didn't
but it's
win in the
fascinating
world against Warcraft.
Because if you look at, any number of properties, but I think today, probably in this marketplace, you're more likely to see Conan the character licensed in.
That's right.
Into one of these. I mean, that's where I think the war is at the moment. And it makes me a little bit scared for Hollywood that they don't understand that this is happening, that there are several platforms, you can say Fortnite being one, Call of Duty, Roblox, Minecraft, etc., that they're going to become so big that the other games and things will potentially just exist within them.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
But your point is that essentially, I mean, licensing in games makes me think back to like the 90s and those kinds of just like totally weird licensed things. But even in that world, the star almost is the game. It's that ecosystem and the fact that your friends are there, not the celebrity or the character per se.
Certainly in games like any game that hits a critical mass has a huge competitive advantage there, where they can A, become the platform, and B, they don't necessarily need the star, right? Minecraft doesn't have a star, Roblox doesn't have a star, and I think you'd probably be hard put to try and get an agreement amongst players what even the top game in Roblox is, because it ebbs and flows and different people have different opinions and all of that kind of thing. But to your point about stardom, what we sort of in the industry talk about is like, if clearly these black hole games don't last forever, right? It's not like Counter-Strike Go is the only competitive esports shooter that exists. And what was really interesting to see is that if you look at where Counter-Strike Go was dominant, and then there was this time period where there was like 2 or 3 relatively big sort of skill-based competitive shooters that all came out at the same time. There was Cliff Bleszinski's Lawbreakers. There was Blizzard's Overwatch. I think there was another one as well, and I always forget the name of it, but I think there was like 2 or 3 that hit all around the same time. And collectively, they were competing with Counter-Strike Go for the competitive esports scene. And one of them won, which was Overwatch, right? It killed basically the others. So yes, there were other challenges with Lawbreakers and that kind of thing, but ultimately Overwatch became enough of a black hole on its own that it could kind of go head to head with Counter-Strike Go for those sort of, those esports eyeballs. And so one of the things that's interesting there is that the star there was the familiar. It wasn't a specific actor. It wasn't a specific player, a specific, whatever. It was, you want Counter-Strike, you want competitive shooting, but you're a little bit bored of it because you've been playing it for 5 years. We're going to give you enough of what you know so that you can pick up and play and be good at it instantaneously, but also enough innovation and diversity and new experience that it's going to feel like an innovative
and
thing.
wrapped in a different aesthetic, and they
That's
did
right.
build out the lore a little bit of that in advance, and I think they've been doing since. But that's a really interesting point. So they presumably went into that strategically.
That's my belief, yes. I don't think it was a pure coincidence that these three big games all came out at around the same time trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they were on the phone with each other, let's all launch this at the same time. I'm saying they all read the same tea leaves. They were all looking at the same trends. They were all sort of making the same calls, seeing the same opportunity, and probably gambling on the fact that the market was ready for some new.
Yeah, but it is germane to to our practice, because I think if a client came to us with something that was sort of a middling property and said, I want to do a AAA console game, I think the advice might be, well, let's think about this carefully. Is there an opportunity to partner with a company instead that has more expertise, or is there a sort of a space in doing things in mobile or what have you? I think it'd be very, very hard, and I think the days of as we said earlier, to sort of slap on a license onto something and call it a day, is sort of gone, because the play. I mean, that's the thing I would say. It's been really interesting because gamers are incredibly discerning in terms of they communicate a lot and sophisticated, and they follow the Metacritic and everything else. Hollywood, that was not the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was very broad. You would blast for opening sort of weekend and get people into the theaters. And I think one of the things that they've had to deal with as a reckoning a little bit is the fact that now the audience talks to each other through social media and so forth. And so you have to think about your audience a little bit more. Not necessarily to the same level of degrees, because I think gaming is, it's the people are just so devoted, which is just a wonderful thing. But it's definitely changed, I think, in film and television.
So do you think our Hollywood our film deals more complicated or less complicated to negotiate than interactive? Or can you make such broad generalizations, or is it really case by case?
It's very hard because they deal in such everything's so different. The way that the companies are structured is very different. Often in gaming companies, the business deals are actually done by non-lawyers, not by lawyers, and there's a bigger sort of what I would say is sort of siloing or differentiation between the legal and the business functions. In entertainment companies, maybe slightly more aligned in certain respects, but here's the thing. It's very easy for me to sort of prognosticate and say, well, you should be doing this and thinking about these, these things from a sort of a multi-platform, expansive sort of perspective. But even making a single movie is extremely difficult.
Right. Of course.
From a financing, business, creative, practical perspective. So I think that to twist around your question a little bit, they're all hard in their own ways. What is particularly difficult, and what I really hope that I'm able to do from a career perspective, is to try to act as a facilitator or a translator between those businesses. Because if you think about where we are potentially going in terms of things that sort of live at that convergence, interactive storytelling, bringing sort of film and Hollywood properties into quote unquote the metaverse or into gaming, you have to be able to translate in terms of the way that the deals work, and in terms of the way that the cultures work. And so hopefully that's a role for an attorney or for somebody in sort of a business affairs type of a capacity. It's just different, Hollywood. Yes, you might have, very rarely you'd have like the Snyder cut, right, where there's something is iterated, but generally speaking, you release it and it's released. Whereas gaming, you continually iterating, which is quite a different process, and you can end up with something.
Certainly these days with like games as a service or live platforms or anything like that, I think there is still significant genre of gaming that is a little bit more like the box product that is shipped and is kind of like a Hollywood movie. Like it's done, it's released. Maybe they have a DLC, maybe they do some bug fixing, but they're definitely looking at a pretty spiky long tail kind of thing in terms of
I think
sales
it's a
and
continuum for sure, for sure. But but it's interesting, sort of the gaming as a service model, because a lot of those games increasingly are given away for free.
Yes.
But they have completely different sort of models, and I think that's something else that if you're in, I mean, not just I won't just say in film and television. If you're in publishing, if you're in graphic novels, if you're any of these things, you wouldn't necessarily be familiar with that.
So do you have like one or two like key differences, or like, let me phrase this a different way. What's something that you think, Hollywood agency or like a Hollywood creative might wish that game developers knew or thought about, and vice versa? What's something you think game developers think kind of like Hollywood maybe doesn't get, or that they see very differently? What's an example there of a place where there's a bridge that needs to be formed across those sort of two different cultures, those two different worldviews?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind, immediately, and it's very, very sort of rudimentary and fundamental, is what are we making? Because generally speaking, where with our work for studios, for example, the options are motion picture. Granted, now that could be theatrical or streaming, or series, and it could be ongoing or limited, and those are generally the thing. I mean, obviously, sometimes there's a live stage, or sometimes contemplated a podcast first, but it's pretty sort of clear, and so you can build parameters around this. Gaming companies, very often it's, we think this thing is cool, we don't know what we're going to do yet. And so, which is fine, but that kind of gets us back to the very start of this conversation, which is, it's a lot, it's frankly, sort of professionally richer, but it's also much, much better for the client, or for the opposing party, if the negotiators can actually have discussions and be involved and talk these things through, because that there are ways that one can draft and kind of create optionality and create these kinds of decision trees,
leave doors open
for things, but it's very hard to sort of do it without having that access. And so I think that some of our strongest relationships on sort of the TV and film side of things, and frankly what I really love, is when we can have some level of interaction with the creative executives, and with production, and with finance, because it all goes to my job. It helps me craft the scope of the rights and the financials if I know what the potential avenues for exploitation of a property are. It helps me to make deals if I've been on a number of calls recently with like CFOs, modeling out various structures for productions. It's immensely helpful, and I think that having those kinds of discussions, whether it's with the council, or whether it's with the other side, and literally allowing the stakeholders to talk through these kinds of options, and I think in terms of what I think Hollywood maybe should know, to me, it's not like it's a secret. It's something that's just eminently there in the culture, which is, if you're under the age of 30, you're not watching linear television. You're not, we saw the Oscar ratings. I don't see it really coming back in a strong way. And so the future is in these interactive communities. And so I think that there's still a little bit of a bias that Hollywood has towards film, the glory of film, and I do get it. I love films myself, but it's like, that's the but sort of financially, it's not really a comparison in terms of the size and scope. But moreover, the way it's only going to trend in that direction. I think what you said is absolutely key. That the fact that these things are not just divergent. like diversions for somebody. Oh, I've got half an hour, I'm going to go and play it on my little game. I mean, I think a lot of people in Hollywood still think of gaming, going down in the basement and playing on your Atari. It is a culture, but it's a community.
Yeah.
It's where these people's friends are, and it's where they socialize, and it's their connection, and it's the bedrock of their things. So as you say, you go into school or college or work on Monday morning, and if you weren't in the Fortnite game, for example, or
you don't get that water cooler moment.
You don't. Yeah, it's what it used to be. Must see television on a Thursday night.
We're talking about Lost.
Yeah. Well, precisely. Did you see the trailer for the new season of this? Did you? I mean, I played through Resident Evil Village on the on the weekends. I've certainly got things I want to talk, but it's like that thing, and you see some of this in television. Like Game of Thrones, that was the thing. Like you would go and then you would listen to the podcast and go on the forums and speculate and so forth. But it's sort of to a different level, and it's not only gaming. It's also things like, I think, Twitch and TikTok and things like that, where there's a community feeling there, but it's so enormously powerful. And you're starting to see this sort of value being put on it a little bit more by the traditional entertainment companies, but not enough. That's my feeling.
Cool. Yeah, and I think actually that dovetails really interestingly into this next question that I think will be fun. We'll see. We'll try one. I wrote down some scenarios.
You're spot on. I've got no idea where this conversation is going, but I'm enjoying it.
I wrote down these scenarios, right? And what I think will be fun is to have you pick apart these scenarios a little bit. Like, I kind of want to hear how your brain works when you're thinking about like rights and opportunities and, ooh, this is going to be sticky, and oh, we got to make sure that our contract has this provision. And I mean, obviously, you can't do it all, but I think, when a player hears like the scenario I'm about to give you, like a player is probably going to go, cool, that sounds fun. When do I get to do that? Whereas you're probably going, oh my God, how do I structure that? So I just love, let's see if this works. So here's a hypothetical scenario. Marvel partners with GTA Online.
Okay.
And a creator comes along, and they create a persona, call it, Captain Awesome, whatever. And they're doing their GTA Online roleplay, but they're always doing it wearing the Captain America skin. Always. So it's kind of like how Dream, the Minecraft player, like you never see him, or like some of these digital creators who like you never actually see their face. Right. Imagine it's like that. It's only ever the avatar, so you never actually see the person. And over time, this creator is like creating a persona, and they've got like a quirk, like, I don't know, stay classy, Boston, or like whatever. Like they have some sort of tagline that becomes like deeply associated with the Captain Awesome persona. And they go viral and awesome and like Mr. Beast level and tens of millions or like whatever. So suddenly, right, this role player is getting almost more fan engagement over Captain America than season 3 of, Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Like more people are tuning in to watch this dude role play Captain America than are actually watching the next Disney Plus season. So Marvel wants some of that, right? They're like, man, we gotta get this Captain Awesome or whatever I called him. I can't remember anymore. We gotta get some of his stuff in season 4. We gotta get that zinger, that Stay Classy Boston zinger in there. And I don't know, he modified the shield to put spiky horns on it or something. Like, we gotta get that in there as well. So suddenly you've got this digital creator who's become so powerful and important from a licensed property that you have the actual brand holder saying, we want some of that action.
Yeah.
Is that ever going to happen?
Well, I mean, look, and yeah, I mean, the answer is in some form or another, probably yes. But let's just think about this and break this down. So please. I'm the player. So I have like an end user, agreement. So one of the things that's changed in gaming over the last, 5 or 10 years is that now almost every game, and certainly anything with an online component, you have to click through the terms of service expressly before you can play. that, I think it was much more limited, on the NES or Super Nintendo or something
Sure.
like that. So I have a contract with, in this case, I suppose it would be Take-Two as the publisher of GTA Online. So I'm in privity with them. Essentially, I am agreeing to a limited license that allows me to play the game and to do certain things in accordance with those terms of service. In this instance, there may or may not kind of be something tacked on that puts me in privity in with Marvel. I mean, this gets the second piece, right? So there's an agreement between Take-Two and Marvel that licenses Take-Two the rights to use this character in a certain way with certain restrictions, and to grant to end users the same things, right? So a lot of this stuff is just obvious. Marvel's not going to want the character to be depicted in a way that that it perceives to be damaging to the brand. And then frankly, I mean, there is a threshold question, which is whether Marvel would ever put its characters into GTA online. But and so one of the components of that is presumably going to be some kind of a work for hire provision, although it's not going to be signed. So there's a question around sort of enforceability, because work for hire provisions typically have to be in signed writing. It's saying from an inception, I'm creating this stuff, but there's probably a license back. So I'm probably as a player, I'm agreeing to some kind of a license to Take-Two, but then by extension Marvel, that anything I do in the game they can use.
So you've painted this picture of, on the one hand, a relatively solid legal framework between the hypothetical Marvel, the hypothetical Take-Two, and the hypothetical player/creator. And at the same time saying, even if legally the framework is relatively simple and who owns the rights is relatively clear, there is an obvious reason why there might want to be another relationship between Marvel and that content creator. So in other words, creator, go get an agent kind of thing, because you might be onto something. They might want to have some sort of separate side agreement with you. So that makes sense to me. And I want to do a second scenario, see if this one is interesting. But this time it's between individuals. Okay. So let's take Roblox as an example, right? So a game blows up on Roblox, or not even, a game appears on Roblox, right? And it's some sort of new mechanic. It's a variant on, I don't know, Bed Wars. My son's playing a bunch of Bed Wars right now and on Minecraft. So someone comes along, makes this mod on Roblox, does something different, does something new. It doesn't blow up, it gets some players, but nothing really huge happens. You come along and you rip it off verbatim. You copy it exactly. You don't change a single thing. But you've got an Instagram community, or you've got a YouTube community, or you've got whatever. And maybe you change one thing. You change the name, or you change instead of being a bed, it's a toothpick. I don't know. You change something minor, but by and large, you've basically just taken this idea that someone else created, and you've brought your community to the table, and now this thing blows up. So as we explore metaverse, and as we explore user-generated content, and as we explore these games as platforms in these persistent worlds that grow through the contributions of the players, right? All of whom want to be discovered, want to be found, want to get that dopamine, want to get those likes, want to go viral, all of that sort of stuff. You're going to see more and more of these situations where, what is new and innovative is not necessarily what gets the attention.
Well,
right?
No, I mean, I think about these, Twitter and Instagram, like meme and joke aggregation sites that just take people's tweets and post them up and so forth. But yes, I mean, should I give you my
yeah, basically,
thoughts?
I guess my question is there anything you think that needs to happen to the kinds of EULAs or deal structures for these games as platforms to be ready for the metaverse, like to be ready for this kind of infinite remixing, or are we already covered?
Well, look, it's interesting because I think it depends from whose perspective you're looking at it. from the perspective of the platform, in essence, it's covered by that sort of scenario. In theory, is covered by the agreement that the player has. I have to presume, essentially, even if the terms of service for the player say that you own something that's creative that you put in there, I'm sure it would say, provided that you are granting a perpetual, non-exclusive, irrevocable license for that piece of content, or that whatever it is, to be used, revised, modified, remixed, distributed, etc., etc. And so, in essence, you are granting the right to the other user to produce it by virtue of having done it in the game. Now, if we are going to move into a situation where these games do expand into what one might call a metaverse, and therefore an economy, and so the position of the platform is, well, we want to create an environment where people are empowered to come and essentially make a living, in theory, within our games. Well, then they need to
Sandbox, Decentraland. I mean, it's speculative, but there's people making real money inside these virtual worlds.
Well, I think this is the way that it's going. I think that this is ultimately the way. This is the end game, which is, if you can get everybody into your platform, of course you let them make money. You just take a transactional fee or something along those lines, not dissimilar to sort of Apple and this is one of the big things that's being fought out right now. And I can't really talk to that to that lawsuit, but it's these kinds of concepts. So in essence, I think that you're going to have to change the scope of your license to create some kind of ownership or some kind of sort of revenue share. But in the fact pattern that you're describing, well, let's take it out of the game right now. Let's say I just you just come up with something, and I rip it up. Rip it off. I just take it and sell it. Well, that's just essentially an IP conceit. And the question is, well, did you have something that is protectable? So is there something that is protected by presumably copyright law or trademark law or perhaps trade secrets or patent? Is there something that's protected by some body of law? And then did I infringe? So did I have access to it? And is there substantial similarity? And the thing about it is, in our this is one of the big questions in our system right now. The only way that can actually be determined if there's a dispute is by some kind of dispute resolution, for example, a court. So in that instance, if you come up with a game and I infringe on your copyright in the protectable elements of the game, you would sue me, and then we either settle it out or a court judges that. And the thing about it is, well, presumably these platforms do not want to get pulled into lawsuits, and they do not want to have to act as an arbiter in terms of determining, well, who's right and who's wrong. So I think it's going to be very hard for them to deviate from a license model that just allows people to remix freely without sort of an issue.
And so, okay, so that's fantastic, and that's basically what I thought. And so once again, the answer is that more or less the legal structures we have in place right now have to be the legal structures that we continue to use even as we build the metaverse, right? That maybe there'll be some small tweaks here and there, but this idea that there's an EULA, that what you're doing inside Roblox, you don't actually own. The IP is owned by either Roblox or the licensee holders of the various products. And yeah, we're paying you, but I mean, it's more like paying you as a service. You don't actually own this thing in question.
Right. Which is a hard concept for users to swap. I mean, you just had to see the sort of the uproar around, say, the shutting down of the potential PS3 and Vita, storefronts and so forth. The idea that you don't actually own something and in theory the access could be revoked.
That's right.
Is difficult, but yes, that's how it works.
Okay, so now let's get to NFTs.
Yes.
Because here's the part I just frankly don't understand. So if
I may not either.
And maybe that's a great place to end the conversation, which is we just don't know what's going to happen. But So if I make a Doritos map in Roblox, right? So clearly Roblox owns the map, Doritos owns the IP, right? And I get some money because I'm generating a bunch of money for Roblox and possibly by extension Doritos in terms of all the in-app purchases and Robux that are spent inside my game. Now, an NFT it's a digital pointer, right? Like it's a pointer to a thing. I could mint an NFT for that Roblox map, basically saying like, here's the login and password to administer this Roblox map at this date and time. You know, whoever buys this NFT becomes the new whatever owner of this NFT. They don't have rights to the map. They don't have rights to Doritos, but they've somehow NFT'd this instance, this expression of those things. So how does NFT and this pointer to a thing, how does that digital providence impact these kinds of conversations, right? So legally, I can't come to you and say, look, you ripped off my thing, because no court of law is going to want to hear that case. But if I have an NFT showing providence and a kind of per pixel match between what I minted and what you're now making a lot of money from, is there something there that's useful, or is it still just, look, the EULA trumps everything, you know, whatever, the NFT does nothing?
So let me, I suppose, I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm following the NFT thing. I'm not an expert in it. My partner, Sarah Odenkirk, is. Both from the legal perspective and the practical. I mean, she's actually minted her own NFTs, and she's been a big sort of advocate, and so it's far better to speak to these kinds of things than I. But as a general premise, you know, what the fact pattern that you're describing is happening every day in one way or another. I was just reading an article, I think yesterday, about artists who are discovering their work on these NFT sites without their knowledge and consent. And so what I would say first and foremost is that you know, the concept of an NFT does not trump intellectual property law, and presumably, especially around some of these bigger sales.
You heard it straight from the lawyer, kids. Don't go minting stuff you don't own.
Yeah, I mean, it's presumably, you know, it's presumably could be trademark infringement. It could be copyright infringement. You know, I think that the actual way that the court kind of comes down and analyzes it is sort of TBD. I think there will be a lawsuit, but in essence, I think it's going to come down on the favor on the side of the rights holder, because from a policy perspective, the whole point here is to sort of reward the artist. And I would say, you know, one of the exclusive rights that's reserved to an author under copyright law. An author means, you know, creator, is the right to create derivative works. So at the very least, you know, creating an NFT is probably some form of derivative work. So there's that aspect, which is kind of for the private, you know, like, you know, I take a piece of your art, or I take that picture behind you of Shadow of the Colossus and mint it. Well, I would imagine I'll be getting a call from Sony pretty sharpish. The fact pattern you said with the Doritos and so forth, well, now we've got multiple rights holders. I can assure you that there is nothing in your license agreement with Roblox that gives you the right to mint an NFT using Doritos. And probably one of the byproducts of the past 3 months is lawyers furiously going back into contracts and terms of service to expressly reference NFTs. I mean, there was a Los Angeles Times article a couple of weeks ago about comic book artists who traditionally have had the right to have retained the physical artwork and have been able to sell it. Right. And now it's, you know, and it's being expressly sort of written into contract. I have to imagine that there is going to be something like a negative covenant, you know, notwithstanding anything to the contrary. End user will have no right to create any form of derivative work, including without limitation any form of NFT or other digital asset. So that's a stop right now on the Doritos piece, there's probably that also comes from the platform as well. Now, as we get more progressive, ultimately, and we move into this metaverse, construction, some very smart people are going to have to work this out, because it's a huge, I think, a huge opportunity, particularly in sort of gaming and virtual worlds. We've already seen people will pay for. I mean, it's amazing. I remember, I played Oblivion for God knows how many hours, and I sort of remember. I think it was either Oblivion or Skyrim was the first, but like the horse armor was one of the first pieces. It must have been Oblivion, right? The DLC on Xbox 360,
on
and
a
everyone was
premium
like,
title, so it was very controversial
and it was,
at the time.
it was hugely controversial, but now it's completely commonplace.
Well, we do have also an episode coming out in the next couple of months where we deep dive into NFTs, and I'm sure I will do many more of them because it is such a dynamic space. So maybe we'll bring you and your partner Sarah back on, and we can continue this conversation later on in the year and sort of take stock of where things went in the metaverse and crypto space.
It's going to be fascinating. Let's hope we don't doom the planet in the. In the process.
Proof of stake, right? That's what everyone's betting on, right? Proof of stake as the thing that's going to save the world.
Exactly.
Simon, this has been fantastic. We're sitting at over an hour now. It's going to be hard work to trim this down to the target, because I found this conversation fascinating. But just before we let you go, before we say goodbye, any closing thoughts about themes or subjects you thought we were going to dive into that we didn't get a chance to explore? Do you feel like we covered did we cover the broad, in a broad spectrum, the kinds of things we had set out to discuss?
Yeah, no, look, I think this was fantastic. From my perspective, it's just interesting because I think possibly what's evident is that there's a very thin, wafer thin line between my professional work and my personal interests. And I just find the whole space sort of fascinating. It certainly informs my work and clients. And look, one thing we really as a group try to pride ourselves on is thinking deeply about the business of our clients, because then we can represent them better. But notwithstanding that, it's just a really, really interesting time. And frankly, I think it's marvelous that you have this podcast and you're exploring these kinds of things and sort of talking about them with such a broad variety of people. So thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you for being on. I really enjoyed it. Simon Pulman, everyone, hope you enjoyed the interview. Until next time, Simon, have a great afternoon. Again, thank you so much. And that's a wrap. Thanks very much, Simon, for joining me on the Tomorrow with Rovio. I'm your host, Ben Mattis, and to all of you listeners or watchers out there, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, please don't hesitate and reach out. Let us know sort of what other themes you think we should explore, who you think we should be talking to. And until next time, have a good evening. Bye, everyone.